Hello, Augies worldwide. I'm Dave Kassler, amateur radio call sign KE0OG, here with episode number 282 of Ask Dave. I've been gone for a couple days, and let me just mention why. On Monday morning, I had some dental work done that ended up resulting in a tooth extraction. And that has kind of, it's amazing what such a tiny part of the body can do to the rest, but I think I'm starting to get back to normal. Today I thought we'd talk about amplifiers and how to connect them to your station and some considerations. This is motivated by a question from an Augie, and let's answer it. We'll do this by looking at a chart on adding a linear amp to your station. I'm going to talk about 5 things here. Cost-benefit considerations. Is it really worth it to have an amp? Tube versus transistor, because that's the big difference going on in amps these days. Power considerations. You've got to get power to this thing, and you have to get more power to it than you might think. Connections have to be done correctly between the amp and your rig. So we'll talk about those. And some operating considerations. Okay, first, amps boost your signal, and I'm talking about HF amplifiers, and they're linear amplifiers. Now, suppose another station hears your 100-watt signal as S7. Okay, that's the basic consideration we're going to make here and see what an amplifier does for you. If you were to boost your signal to 600 watts, which is about what I can do with mine, that will give you 7.8 dB of gain. So your signal will be S8 plus a tad. So, okay, you're getting a little more than 1 S unit gain. And instead of seeing you as S7, they'll see you as a little bit over S8. Now, if your signal went all the way to 1,000 watts, that's a factor of 10, which is 10 dB of gain. So your signal will be somewhat under S9. It'll be S8 plus 4 dB or S9 minus 2 dB. Boosting your signal to the legal limit of 1,500 watts, PEP, gives you 12 dB of gain. So your S7 signal will then be S9. Now, if you've been on HF a lot, you know that there isn't a lot of difference. You've heard lots of S7 signals. You've heard lots of S9 signals. There's not a huge difference in there, but it will boost your signal, and sometimes in marginal conditions, that 2 S units is worth every bit. Now, I'm basing this on 6 dB per S unit, which is a commonly used convention. However, even modern radios have got absolutely lousy S meters. They're usually set so that 50 microvolts to a 50 ohm input will give a reading of S9. But then it's sort of, anybody's guess from there. How much per S unit and so on. But it's what we've got as a measure. Now, there are other ways to boost your signal. Obviously, the first one, a better antenna. If you can get the antenna outside, further up in the air, get a gain antenna like a hex beam or a Yagi or something like that, it will make a big difference, maybe even bigger than getting an amplifier. There are also technique improvements that you can use. You work on your timing. If you're working other stations, if you wait too long to answer a CQ, they'll move on. Or if you wait too long to answer a DX station, they'll move on. The use of phonetics, speaking very clearly, learning what works on the air, those will also boost your signal. Now, I remark here about the previous owner of this 500 watt amplifier that I have, that he worked out of his car. He had a homeowners association situation where he couldn't have an antenna at home, so he put in a mobile rig, and he knew that his antenna on his mobile rig was very much compromised antenna, so he pushed 500 watts through it from his car. And that put him basically on par with other stations. And so he could talk to other stations. That worked for him really well. And that may be what you can do too. Now let's talk about tube versus transistor. High power transistors are still evolving. And prices are falling. You can now buy 1500 watt transistor amplifiers. They are expensive. We're talking thousands of dollars for one of those. So tube amps, especially in the 500 or so watt category, above 500 watts, like going up to 1500 watts, are still compelling economically. In other words, they're cheaper. Now, there are various automation features in amplifiers as we go that make them easier to use. So this guy's 1500 watt amplifier might be pretty basic. That other one might have automatic band switching, automatic tuning, whatever. Okay, so you pay for features as well as for power. Oh, speaking of power, let's look at this. Power out isn't the same as power in. For example, your 100 watt radio has a DC input of 13.8 volts and 22 amps. That's 300 watts. Whoa, 300 watts in for 100 watts out? Where does the other 200 watts go? Well, it goes as heat. It's not all the time, though, of course, because that's just on peaks. The fact that you're using a linear form of modulation means there's going to be a lot of inefficiency. Now, a 500 watt output amplifier, such as mine is the Ameritron ALS 500M, on peaks uses 16 volts and 80 amps. That's 1280 watts. Okay, that 1280 watts has got to come from somewhere. Comes from the power supply, of course, but then that's got to come from the wall outlet too. And that's like 11 amps or something like that. Now, much beyond that, and you're going to need to rewire your shack for 240 volts AC. You know, just the same as you would if there were a dryer, washer and dryer, if there were a dryer in your shack, and you know how much heat those put out. You'll need to wire for that because a single 120 amp circuit usually can't handle more than 1800 watts total, which includes everything on the circuit like lamps, your HF rig power, etc., etc. Okay, I know that just with my 500 watt amp, when I really hit it, the amps will flicker just, the lamps will flicker just a little bit. Now, I've had a number of questions as to how to position various pieces of equipment. The transceiver goes directly into the amplifier. All modern amplifiers are reasonably modern, like the last 20, 25 years, have a 50 ohm input. So you don't need a tuner between the transceiver and the amplifier. Some of the older tube amps, that's a little different, but I'm talking about old. Here, normally you feed your transceiver directly into the amplifier, and then you feed that into a high power tuner, and then your antenna. Now, I don't have a high power tuner, so I have to strive hard to make sure that all of my antennas are actually resonant at the frequencies they're used at, so that I don't need a tuner. Now, there are a minimum set of connections from the rig to amp. If you buy an Elecraft amp to use with an Elecraft radio, your connections are going to be more complicated than this because the amp offers so many features, automatic band switching, that will take more connections. But here are your basic connections. The power out of the transceiver is your coax, and that goes via coax to the power in of the amplifier. Now, does the amplifier add power to your signal? No. It uses the input of your signal to drive the amplifier in there. So the 100 watts out from your radio will just be absorbed as heat by the amplifier. Now, many amplifiers do not need all 100 watts of that. I'll come to that in a minute. Also, your transceiver needs to tell the amplifier when it's going into transmit mode. Okay, because when it's not in transmit mode, the amplifier is just a pass-through for your signal. Because the received signal comes in to the amplifier, goes back to the transceiver through that coax. But when you go to the transceive, the transmit push-to-talk out line, which is usually a phono jack, is grounded. That tells the amplifier to go into transmitter mode. Okay, Now, some of the real old amplifiers, and I'm talking restoral projects here, require more from the push-to-talk out than a modern transceiver can give, which is a few milliamps at 5 volts. So you'll have to put a relay in there. Now, the ALC, the automatic level control, is actually put out by the amplifier. If it detects too much drive, it will send a signal back to the transceiver telling it to hush, quiet down. Okay? Now, often that will run your transceiver back around 60 or 70 watts, is all that is needed as a drive input for the amplifier. Now, my amplifier, oddly enough, does not have the ALC connection. So I have done tests and determined that if I set my transceiver output at 62 watts, that's enough to drive the amplifier all the way. If I do any more than 62 watts, it's 1, wasted power, 2, it can cause distortion in the output. So I've got to remember to do that. I really do wish it had the ALC in. By the way, the ALC is a small negative voltage going from 0 to -4. 0 volts means that the transceiver should crank out all the power it wants. -4 volts actually shuts it all the way down. So it'll be a voltage somewhere in between, usually also phonojack, right here. Some operating considerations concerning amplifiers are these. Use the amp only when necessary. Part 97 requires that you use the minimum required power to have a satisfactory connection. Now, the definition of satisfactory varies widely, of course, but use it when necessary, not as a matter of course. I would suggest you call CQ without an amp, because what I have found is if I call with the amp, somebody will hear me really well, and they'll try to talk to me. They don't have an amp, and I can barely hear them. So I call CQ without an amp, and then add the amp if I need it to maintain the contact. Don't use your amplifier with digital modes, because there is a little bit of distortion in any, even though it's supposedly linear amplification procedures. The linear amps are primarily meant for speech and CW. Don't use them with the digital modes because you really want your rig to be as linear as you can. Actually drop your power out to about 50 watts and keep it there. That's plenty for digital modes. I do encourage you to use speech compression. If in a situation where you might want to use an amp, using speech compression properly adjusted will allow your signal to appear about 3 dB stronger than it really is. That's because instead of just hitting the high power on the peaks, it pulls up the average power by quite a bit. Oh, and of course, do strongly consider a better antenna, including those with gain. And there are lots of antennas out there with gain. The least expensive are the hex beams, and you can go on from there. By the way, I do have a hex beam. It's the MFJ hex beam, and I use that with the amplifier sometimes when I'm on 20 meters. So there you go. There's a quick overview of amplifiers, how and when to use them, and so on. And thank you very much for all of your kind support. I appreciate it very much. And I'm sure my tooth will get better because all the ones I've had pulled before have. So we'll just take it from there. So I'm going to say 73 for now, and we'll catch you next time.